And you can
Uh,
let it all out now.
yeah. Um, I'd say one of the biggest things I've noticed over time, and I realize this might differ by country, but um, grad students don't have kind of like a lot of autonomy in the American system because you're often like assigned to a lab and you're sort of assigned to a project, but that also can still be really dependent on the funding for that project. Um, so one thing that came up a lot in graphene was, or in my research was, we were interested in this graphene project, but it didn't necessarily get a lot of direct funding. So it was trying to figure out like ways to do the research that fit in with other things going on in the lab. Um,
Mhm.
and sometimes that meant like questions that I wanted to answer that I thought would be like really helpful for understanding this production process. Um, just weren't really something I could do because that would take too much time away from something else. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think it would be great if we could somehow maybe fund more of like what the grad students are doing as a grad student, then tie it into like just the projects that go on. Which evidently I've learned from friends sort of exist in like the American National Institutes of Health, where like grad students can get their own funding directly instead of
Mhm.
being like the designated student on a project that was assigned to the lab. Uh,
Mhm.
and so I think that could be cool because it lets you take like a bit more ownership and also probably does help you. Like I've enjoyed my experience overall, and like I do think I've become more independent, but I think getting to like kind of completely like control the project from start to finish probably does help you develop more of that like independent scientist streak that and also the idea of like how do you manage a project from start to finish. Because
Mhm.
I'm done, but I know there's definitely other questions we would like to answer about my dissertation, but I'm not going to. So that will
But
be up
yeah.
to the next student. I'd say my second wish is maybe more support for interdisciplinary research, and I realize that can always be vague. And I just really remember there was a great conversation I had. We opened this new environmental resilience institute at the University of Virginia several years ago, and in a really cool conversation with a student from the landscape architecture program, which I did not even know existed. I didn't know we had like a master's or PhD in that. Um, and we had this cool conversation because the original motivation for my project was we wanted to add graphene to plastics to try to
Mhm.
make them stronger, or maybe they could be electrically conductive. Um, and this landscape architecture student's thesis was she wanted to try using this invasive plant species as like a biomaterial. And so when she heard about like my goals of trying to add graphene to composites, she was like, oh, it's like you can make this kind of really weak bioplastic from this invasive plant species, but could we add your nanoparticles to it and make it stronger? Um, and she even met with my advisor and they were talking about it. But it turned out there was no funding in the institute yet for such a project, especially like a project that didn't really have an experimental proof of concept.
Mhm.
Um, but it sounded really cool. Like, what if you could try to get rid of this like invasive plant species by using it as a biomaterial? Um, and so I know like interdisciplinary can be a buzzword, and sometimes I think that too, but this was like, it felt like really unfortunate here because these were like two very different fields trying to come together, like materials and chemical engineering with architects, with landscape architecture. And so it just seemed unfortunate that there wasn't something to help try to like let us run with that and study it more. Uh,
Mhm.
and then my final wish, and this is definitely my I just finished my dissertation wish, um, is better standards about reporting on results in material science, especially with nanoparticles. Oh, And it's also, I will say, it is a literature supported WIS because I read this paper in the middle of in the middle of writing my dissertation about how it turns out that lots of the graphene nanoplatelets you can buy on the market are not actually graphene. Um, and it turns out like the storage times are so long, they're starting to like clump back together into graphite. And so like none of their properties are what the producer is reporting. And this seems to be responsible for a large number of papers that have like negative results from using commercially available graphene to make a new kind of device or product. Definitely feel like I've seen papers now where we're talking, where someone will talk about making some form of graphene, and it just seems like most of the argument is like, here is one like electron microscopy image, and here's one vibrational spectrum, and it looks like graphene. And I'm just like, okay, but like, do we know how thick it is? Do we know, like, on average, how big these flakes are? Because that's
Mm.
really important for the comparison.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, standardization on reporting scientific findings in the materials research, and especially in the nano research, I feel there is no nomenclature, or there is no standard. There are no standards that define, okay, this is the nanomaterial and this is not the nanomaterials. It's a bit difficult
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Okay, I think all three of your wishes are very fair, and I wish I could grant them, but I can't. However, about your first one, the autonomy for the graduate students, I think there is a fellowship program called Marie Curie. I don't know if you have that in the America. In the USA, there is Marie Curie, which allows the PhD student to some extent to have control over the research. But I might be wrong here. But maybe you want to check that out.
And I know in the US, like one of the biggest things that is kind of like that, there's the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program.
Mm-hmm.
But you can only apply to that like your first or second year in graduate school. Um,
Oh, okay.
and so I was not really organized enough. I knew I was interested in applying, but I did not have a good idea of what my dissertation project was at that point in time. And
Mm.
my professor, I switched advisors at the end of my second year. Um,
Oh.
and my first advisor actually like was really hesitant about me even applying for the NSF because he was like, okay, but you'd have to make like this completely separate project that might be different from what the lab is doing. And I was like, but wouldn't that be cool? Because then I could do this project. And so it turns out like I think he was actually maybe like, but I don't want you to do your project. I want you to do my project.
Well, now you have successfully defended your PhD.
Yeah.
So if you stay in research in the long term, maybe you can make these changes happen. Hopefully. Speaking of the future, what are you most looking forward to in the next 3 months?
uh that's a good question. So I am actually
I
literally
have very good questions for you.
Um, as we are recording this, I think I am literally later today submitting the final version of my dissertation manuscript.
Congratulations!
Thank you. So I am really excited to do that because then I can officially say I'll be a doctor after it takes 24 hours to process that. um, and then I'm applying to a big policy fellowship this week in America where you could go work in Washington, D.C. for a year in science policy. So I'm excited to finish up that application because you can't apply until you're done with your dissertation. So this is actually a really busy week for me.
A big week for you.
um,
Deadlines.
And then I hope to hear back about some of my other fellowship and job applications. I've applied for a fellowship in the spring uh, at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and this is around the time we hear back. And then I'm also looking at other like jobs or postdoctoral positions. So I'm excited to start hearing back about things now that I can finally tell people that like I have the degree instead of like guessing. It's like I'll be done somewhere between June and April. I'm like, no, I know I'm done now. It's like, okay, I'm no longer giving you like an entire year.
Okay, that all sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So, before we end, what I would like to know from you is, fresh doctor, soon to be doctor. What do you think are, in your opinion, what are the challenges faced by by these big field that is materials and nanoscience, the interdisciplinary field that we have here? What are the challenges? What do you think?
I'd say this is really closely related to my third wish, um, especially as we're starting to move, because a lot of research in carbon nanomaterials, the fundamentals of that are pretty mature now. Like carbon nanotubes were discovered, or some would say like rediscovered, but finally appreciated in the early 1990s. Buckminster fullerene was discovered in the 80s. Graphene was made in 2004. I think it was 2004. Maybe it was
Yes,
2006. Yeah.
it was 2004.
Okay. Yeah. And so, like, we know these materials have these wonderful properties. We would like to make all these kind of like products and devices with them. But you're only going to do that if you can make them in large quantities and still have like a consistently high quality throughout. And so, like, one of the problems with the blender method, while it can produce like a large amount of graphene, one of the things you need to kind of accommodate is that it tends to be, kind of to use a favorite colloid science term, but often about like the lengths of polymers, you can kind of consider it as polydisperse. So there's like an average size, an average thickness, but you have a distribution. It's more like a bell curve than just like everything is the one thickness, the one length. And so, which could be fine. Like people manage to work with like mixtures of polymers all the time, but you need to understand how to work with that. Um, and so and sometimes you do need to like separate that more. So I think the challenge we see as we manufacture graphene or nanotubes at the large scale is, what's the way of kind of characterizing this distribution? And so we need to have more kind of standardized reporting on like, what is the average thickness, what is the distribution of thicknesses, what is the average length of a flake, and what is the distribution of those sizes as a result of these different manufacturing processes. And to do that, we're going to kind of, I think, need to standardize how we report these things. Similar to how it's like, I do think in colloid literature about polymers that has become pretty accepted. It's like there's all these different ways of quantifying like the number average, the volume average, the length average, depending on the application. And right now, sometimes it feels like if you're reading a paper, it's just like, it would probably be good for this one application. So we did that one application, but we didn't necessarily tell you a lot about like the full distribution of properties this graphene has.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're going to need that if we want to start making it large scale, because obviously when you move from like a simple lab process or painstakingly putting Scotch tape through a single piece of graphite to make a giant flake of graphene, we have to accept that we're going to get imperfections, which is true of all material science, right? Like we study lots of defects in materials, and sometimes we want them. So I think that's going to be part of how we go from the lab to actually making the materials that can be useful for like the different technological challenges we face.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes complete sense. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Matthew, for speaking to us. And we look forward to your time on Real Sci Nano.
Great. Thank you so much, Konati.
Thank you for listening. To know more about us, please visit our website, realscientistsnano.org, and follow us on Twitter at realsci_nano.